welcome to all. We are so excited to see so many people here and to have political science department here. I think this is going to be a really exciting event, and welcome to Pubs and Profs officially if you've never been able to join us before. Typically it is an in-person event, but with the times we adapt. So yeah, I'm really excited to see everyone here. As we go through the presentation, if you have any questions that pop in, you can go ahead and send a chat, and your chat question will go to the hosts, and they will work them in as we can, as time allows. So with that, I think I will go ahead and hand it over to Linfield Political Science to introduce yourselves and get the night going.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kaylee, so much for the kind introduction. It is so great to see so many wonderful people here, many of whom I know near and far in Zoom land. Thank you for being here and being engaged citizens, which is so important and to us all and near and dear to our hearts. My name is Patrick Cottrell. I am the chair of the Political Science Department, for those of you who don't know me. And we have two other members of our department here to share some thoughts on the election. I'll allow them to introduce themselves very quickly so you can get a quick visual. Dimitri, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Pat. My name is Dimitri Kelly, and I am a professor in the political science department. I teach classes in political psychology and media and political inequalities. And yeah, there's a lot of things to say about the 2020 election. So I anticipate us having a robust conversation.
And then we have Nick Buccola. Nick.
Hey, everybody. Nick Buccola, also in the Department of Political Science. And I teach courses in political theory and public law. And my primary area of research interest is in American political thought. So I don't really do real American politics like Dimitri does, campaigns and elections and statistics and that sort of thing, but think about things from a kind of historical, philosophical perspective. So I'm excited to be here for this conversation.
And I should say that regrettably we're missing the MVP of our department, Professor Dawn Novatsky, who couldn't be with us tonight, but she did send a couple of tidbits that we'll try to factor into our presentation. So first of all, my background, for those of you that are interested in why the family feud, is behind me. We had our department holiday extravaganza last night. Normally we do an in-person white elephant party that some people in the audience have participated in. But this year we did it online, and we had a family feud, which was quite a bit of fun. So I just neglected to change the background, but what the heck, it is fun and the holiday season. So let's so our topic tonight is the 2020 election, what happened and what next. And I want to thank Joni Claypool and Kaylee Larkin for all of their great work in putting this event together. The Pubs and Profs program is so fantastic, and I participated in it once before, and I've attended a couple of them, and it's a great opportunity for us as faculty to engage with you, the broader Linfield community, on topics that are very important. And there are a few topics that have been so much in the media than the 2020 presidential election. So I guess tonight's is kind of pubs, profs, and politics. Get a bunch of people, have some drinks, and talk politics. What could go wrong, right? I say that kiddingly after our Thanksgiving holiday. Hopefully everyone had a good one. So this election has, in many ways, been unprecedented in our lifetimes. It occurred amidst a pandemic, a wave of social protest, and in an increasingly polarized, hyper-polarized, as many put it, political environment. What's more, the integrity of the election process is being challenged from many different angles. And so our hope tonight is to share some thoughts grounded in our work in political science to help make sense of this momentous election and its aftermath. By way of introduction, let me just say, one of the questions I get a lot as a political science professor is how we handle talking about sensitive political issues in the classroom. I want to acknowledge up front that politics can be very personal for people, and our students are no different. In political science, I mean, one of the things, at least speaking for myself, what do we do as political science scientists is we try to explain and understand complex political outcomes. We draw from peer-reviewed research and ask questions like, how do we know? We wrestle with theories that help us make sense of human behavior and the governing structures we create. And we struggle with questions of ethics and justice. We tend to approach things as problem-driven, a process of inquiry where we learn from difference and we practice mutual respect. And I have to say that, you know, this year has been challenging on a lot of levels for students and faculty alike, but I could not be more proud of our students. They have really just impressed me in their maturity, in their ability to, and students come from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different locations, different political persuasions. And it's been quite inspiring for me personally to be able to have these conversations in a way where I always feel like I'm learning from difference. And if you want to get a flavor of some of the activities our students are involved in, you can check out our new student-led PolyTalks podcast. They set up a connections program to set up some mentoring opportunities with alumni. If you'd be willing to participate in that, that would be great. And if you want to see some of the other goings on, please follow us on social media. It's a student-run account, but it's great and hilarious sometimes. Linfield, POLS_IR on Instagram and Twitter. So with that as an introduction, there's a lot of complex issues here. And so what we thought we would do is try to break things down into two sets of questions. The first is what happened? And so that's our first part of our prepared programming. And each of us will take about 5 minutes to share a question or thoughts that we have on what happened in the 2020 election. And then we will move to the kind of what next. So now that the election is over, what might the future hold? And then hopefully we can proceed to have a conversation based on wherever the audience would like to take it. Kaylee mentioned the chat function is available to post questions, or alternatively, you can email me and at pat@linfield.edu, and I will get the questions, and that way I can ask them as well. I'll be serving as moderator for the question time. And if you have any other, if you'd like to be on our newsletter list from the department, or if you have any interest in being more involved in what we do, please also contact me. I'd love to reach out and have a conversation. So with that, first question, let's turn it over to Dimitri to offer some thoughts on election 2020, what happened? Thanks again, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, Pat, for the introduction. And I also want to thank everybody for being here. So when we were discussing these, separating into these two separate questions where we're going to focus on what happened and then what happens next. So I wrote a lot of stuff down, and then I found that I could basically take the 4 points that I wanted to make and intersperse them in any order and they would still make sense in terms of focusing on what now and what next. So a lot of things happened in the 2020 election. And the true picture of what happened is not going to become clear until after the results of the upcoming twin Senate runoff elections in Georgia, because those are going to decide the control of the Senate and thus either empower or significantly constrain the incoming Biden administration. And I'm going to switch things a little bit, because what I want to talk about is, rather than discuss sort of campaign strategies or anything like that, I want to highlight two sort of things of significance that happened in the 2020 election that I think have received less attention. And I'll speak again in my next section about sort of, the actual result of the election, in the sense that Trump lost and Biden won, and sort of what was behind that. And the first, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about what it meant, what the 2020 elections meant for women in politics. And second, I want to touch briefly on sort of changing nature of political partisanship, partisan identification in the United States political system. So one of the most important and interesting facets of the 2020 election cycle to me, I study political inequality, and the gender gap in terms of political representation is something that we talk about a great deal in my politics of inequality class, and it's something that I find personally very interesting. And so one of the most interesting things to me in the 2020 election cycle was the success of female candidates. So 2018, the midterm elections were sort of much ballyhooed as a sort of new year of the women, and there were 117 women elected or appointed to Congress. And this year, there will be at least 141 women elected to Congress, which surpasses the previous record of 127. Now, first, I think it is actually important to point out that even though this historic number of women, it still only equates to 26% of voting members of Congress, which is a far cry from anything approaching equality or representation in terms of women in the electorate. But second, I think it's also important to note that the gains in female representation were almost entirely driven by the success of Republican women candidates. The number of Republican women elected to Congress will grow from 22 to 36, which breaks the previous record of 30. While the number of Democratic women in Congress is going to remain consistent, it's about 105 members. And so the question, I saw this and I was like, what's going on here? Why did Republican women do so well in this cycle? And the short story is that more of them ran. And more of them ran because more of them were recruited to run. So one of the clearest findings in the literature on the gender gap in electoral politics is that the number one reason that there are so few women in politics is that fewer of them run for office. But when they do run, they win. And they win at the same rate that men do. And in 2020, what happened was Republican women were recruited to run, and as a result, more of them won. Now Pat alluded to my propensity for statistics and data. I promise I'm not going to say any statistics beyond just percentages, but I do like data. And so I want to give you just some numbers to put this in perspective. So in 2018, women made up 33% of all Democratic candidates to the House. And 32.5% of candidates to the Senate. And the end result of that was that women made up 43% of the overall Democratic Congressional Caucus. In contrast, in 2018, women only made up 14% of all Republican candidates to the House and Senate. It's about half the percentage of Democratic candidates. And that resulted in women only making up 13% of the Republicans in the House and 23% of Republicans in the Senate. This year, 21% of all Republicans to the House and 17% to the Senate were women. And that translated into women making up now 26% of all Republicans in the Senate and 23% in the House. I mention this because I think the takeaway from this is sort of universally positive, in that it seems like this, building on top of 2018, would seem to suggest that there is a genuine shift in terms of the norms surrounding women in office. So rather than 2018 being sort of like a flash in the pan, like the original year of the women, which didn't last very long, it seems like now both parties are sort of moving towards and also simply recognizing the electoral advantages and the quality of female candidates out there. But it seems like this is actually a movement towards systemically reducing the gender gap in electoral politics. And the reason for this is because the two parties they have relative parity, right? They're about equal in terms of their electoral competitiveness, and equal representation, or anything even remotely approaching equal representation for women in elected office, would be impossible unless it was happening in both political parties, right? It can't just be driven by one political party. So that's a positive takeaway that I wanted to highlight. The second point, and I'm gonna cut myself short, I promise. The second point I wanted to make is just to briefly note the changing nature of partisanship. So traditionally, we think of like political scientists, and I think pop culture also thinks of party identification as being sort of a psychological attachment to a political party, right? I am a Republican, I am a Democrat, and that means something, and I have this sort of affinity for my political party and for members of my political party. But over time, there have been two sort of seemingly contradictory trends in U.S. politics, and that is, on the one hand, the rise in number of individuals identifying themselves as political independents, as not partisans. And yet at the same time, there's this rise of self-proclaimed political independence has been a increase in sort of party line, consistently party loyal voting, measured by, say, voting for the same party at up and down the ballot, right? Voting for all the one party. And these two things seem like they would be operating in opposition to each other. But the answer to solve this sort of riddle is the rise of what's called negative partisanship. And negative partisanship is defined not necessarily by my sort of affective liking, my preference for my party, so much as it is by my negative attitudes towards the other party. That is, I might not love the Republican Party, but I really don't like the Democrats. And so that might lead me to vote strictly up and down on a Republican Party ticket. So in 1972, consistently loyal party voting was around 50%. And in 2016, it had increased to over 80%. And I suspect that I haven't seen the data breakdown for the 2020 election yet, but I suspect that it's even higher now. And part of this is in 1994, 74% of Republicans had either an unfavorable or a very unfavorable attitude about the Democratic Party. And by 2016, that had grown to 91%. And at the same time, Republicans' affinity, their sort of measure of how much they like or dislike the Republican Party, that is their own party, had stayed basically the same. No real change in terms of increasing attachment to their political party. And for Democrats, self-identified Democrats, the trend has been the same. Attitudes about Democrats towards the Democratic Party have remained consistent, but attitudes from Democrats towards the Republican Party have grown increasingly negative, up from 59 to 85% over the same time period as I just mentioned. And the major driver of this shift seems to be the perception that the other party is growing more extreme. So one of the things that political scientists do is they ask people to sort of imagine placing themselves on an ideological scale. And you place yourself, from liberal to conservative, about where you think you are, and then you place your political party. So if I'm a Democrat, I place the Democratic Party, and it's relatively close to me. And then I'm asked to place the Republican Party. And what's happened is that people's perception of their nearness to their own party has remained consistent, but their perception of how far away the opposition is has grown. And so people are seeing the other party as being much more extreme. And this is one of the reasons Pat mentioned, the sort of hyper-partisanship, one of the reasons why politics feels so tense, and why the 2020 election in particular was extremely tense, was because both sides on this political divide view sort of the consequences of losing an election as catastrophic, as giving the reins of power over to this extreme party. And just to wrap up, in looking at the exit polls in the 2020 election, right, 68%, almost 70% of voters who cast a vote for Joe Biden reported that it was more of a vote against Donald Trump than it was for Joe Biden. And 53% of Trump voters felt the same way, but in the inverse. And so my final point, just to note, is that the election and the election results were much more of a referendum on President Trump than any sort of affirmative endorsement of Joe Biden. And I'm gonna stop right there because I want to give plenty of time for you guys to ask questions and talk later. So I'll throw it back to you, Pat.
Dimitri, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Let me just mention quickly again about questions. As you come up with questions, I have a couple in the queue already, which is great. As they come to mind, Dimitri just said several really, I think, interesting things. If you would like to follow up, ask questions, please send them to me as they come. And what I'll try to do is get to as many as we can in the Q&A, and it helps me to be able to group some of them together so we can have as much of a substantive conversation as possible. I'm next in line here with some opening remarks on what happened. And the question I want to raise here is, what does the election tell us about the health of US democracy? So one of the central concepts I draw on in my research is legitimacy. A democratic government draws its legitimacy, which is its authority, its right to exist, from us, the people, the governed. And this is precisely why elections are so important. So take a second and think about what indicators of a healthy democracy, a healthy, legitimate democracy might be. As you're thinking about this, I suspect that some of your minds, if you're listening to me right now, are you listening? Just check it, would be free and fair elections. Free and fair elections. So universal access, universal suffrage, everybody who wants to vote can vote. Another thing you might be thinking of is the rule of law. And another thing you might be thinking of is the peaceful transition of power. So we just had an election that was kind of close, closer than a lot of people expected, and especially felt close as it unfolded. But it ended up, at the end of the day, being a fairly decisive, in terms of the Electoral College and in terms of the popular vote, win for President-elect Biden. And there were some encouraging signs. We saw little to no political violence. So far, we've had a peaceful transition of power, and the courts are upholding rule of law in the face of claims of election fraud, which they have found so far to be baseless. So in this sense, US democracy has passed a stress test. The same was true in 2000. Some of us might remember the Gore v. Bush case at the Supreme Court. It's really strange, everybody. You know, I've been teaching for a long time now, and I would always be able to reference this election, and people would nod their heads and kind of know they're alive or they've heard of it. It's not. And now, this year, I'm having my first students who were born after the 2000 election have no real, which is crazy to think about. But think back to 2000. Gore v. Bush was much closer than we have this year, right? This came down to hanging chads and 500 votes in Florida. And yet, the Supreme Court decided that, upheld the results in Florida, went all the way to the Supreme Court. We didn't know the outcome until December. I was in DC at the time. It was crazy. People respected the rule of law. There was a peaceful transition of power, and Bush assumes the presidency. Boom, boom, neat and tidy. Okay? Which is the ultimate sign of legitimacy, right, of a government. Now, let me ask you this question, a thought experiment, the counterfactual we like to ask. What if the Gore v. Bush scenario played out in this election? What would have happened if the election came down to one state, say Georgia or Arizona or Pennsylvania? How would it have played out? What role would the Supreme Court have played? And would that role be perceived as legitimate as it was in 2000? Would there be political violence? Would the military be called in to respond in any sense? And fortunately for our democracy, we did not have to confront those questions, but they're still very important ones, because I felt it very disturbing. I don't know if some of you picked up on reports that Walmart had cleared its shelves of all guns and ammunition, and it did so for a reason. So let me tell you what concerns me a bit, even though I'm very gratified that we have had a peaceful, appears to be a peaceful transition of power and peaceful election. The lawsuits that have been filed may be baseless, but they could have priming effects that will come back to bite us in ways that can erode the basis of democratic legitimacy. Think about this. Trust in government right now is already really low. Only 17% of Americans, according to the Pew Foundation today, say that they trust the government in Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time. Only 17%. That means the rest of America has very, very low trust in government. And this is something that the president in 2016 in the campaign played on quite a bit with the Drain the Swamp, right? And now the Twitter feed of the president and partisan media outlets are conducting a systematic effort, well, somewhat systematic, I would say, without any real evidence to undermine the integrity of the election. And very few nationally elected GOP officials have spoken out to the contrary. Now, I want to read to you from a piece that came across my desk today that I found to be quite provocative. And it was by a woman named Amanda Carpenter, who is the former communications director for Ted Cruz, a Republican, who wrote this week of a parasitic relationship between the conservative media and the Republican Party, which she claims has turned into a propaganda party. Here's what she wrote. Propaganda party rules dictate that owning the libs and generating likes, retweets, and reactions online are the key to success. In the absence of any policy platform, a new party operating philosophy has emerged among politicians and media figures alike. Present Trump-friendly figures in the best light possible, and depict anyone who stands in their way as some variation of a socialist, child-eating Satan worshiper. Newsmax CEO Chris Ruddy straight up says that Trump's baseless election lies are working out well. He told the New Yorker, the news cycle, quote, is red hot, and Newsmax is getting 1 million people per minute, according to Nielsen, tuning into Newsmax TV. I think it's good. He added, we have an editorial policy of being supportive of the president and his policies. Whatever those may be, it doesn't really matter. He'll swallow it. Because people like Ruddy and the radio personalities and the Fox primetime hosts have only one primary function now. Keep Trump's GOP alive, no matter what. They feed themselves and feed the political machine at once, and without them, the GOP in its current form will wither and die. The propaganda is the party, and the party is the propaganda. Sink or swim. Now, I want to be very clear. I read this not because it's a partisan issue. This is an American issue. For if we cease to believe in our elections and the integrity of our elections, democracy is done. Robert Dahl, who's a very famous political theorist, once used the metaphor of a reservoir to help illustrate the importance of legitimacy. So long as the water is at a given level, political stability is maintained. And if it falls below the required level, political legitimacy is endangered. I don't think this is what is meant by draining the swamp. I'm an optimist, though, and I do think that I want to end on a somewhat positive note that hopefully we can discuss. And that is, in that same survey, most Americans believe that trust in government can be restored. And the students, we have this very popular series called Pizza and Politics, where we talk about some of the most important political questions of our time. And I think there's a groundswell of support from students about how can we heal as a society, and whether polarization, this hyperpolarization, can be reversed, and if so, how. And so maybe those are some things we can talk about in the conversation that follows. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Nick Buccola. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Dimitri. Thanks, Kaylee and Joni and everybody who helped put this together. It's really, so it's heartening, I think, on the note that Pat just ended on, to see so many folks here interested in having this conversation. And of course, we've seen it from our students as well, and just the desire to have serious conversations about politics, which is what we're all about at Linfield Political Science. And so it's really great to join you. As I mentioned before, I'm a political theorist. I am mostly focused on these big philosophical questions, historical questions about politics. And so I thought I'd start with a quote from a great text of political theory, the Federalist Papers from the American founding era. So here goes. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident or force. That's Alexander Hamilton before he got really famous with the musical. Federalist #1. That was the foundational Federalist paper asking what he called the important question. This question of whether or not we can govern ourselves by reflection and choice, or whether we were doomed to be ruled by accident and force. And I want to sort of use that quote as a framing device for reflecting on this election and this moment, this political moment that we're in. How fares the project of governing ourselves well by reflection and choice? And I just want to sort of mostly pose questions. My students know that the courses I teach almost all have that UQ Linfield curriculum designation, ultimate questions, which we're much better at, political theorists are much better at asking questions than answering them. So I'll try to stick to that approach, and hopefully we can have some conversation about answers in a little bit. But one of the big questions in my mind as I reflect on that basic, the important question that Alexander Hamilton asked is, how much of what's happening right now is a reflection of fundamental disagreement over values, over sort of our core commitments, our moral commitments, if you will, that manifest themselves in our political lives. How much of what's going on right now is a reflection of clashing interests, sort of maybe overlapping with values, but not the same as values, people pursuing interests that are at odds with each other. And then how much of what's going on is a reflection of a crisis of epistemology, right? Which is a fancy way of saying a crisis of our ways of knowing, that we have a fundamental breakdown in how we think we know what we know in our political culture. And that's manifesting itself in a variety of ways. I'm not sure I have a really great answer to that question, those questions, but I want to just play with those questions a little bit, and as a basis for my kind of what happened reflection. And when you look at some of the exit polling, which is always dangerous for me to do as a political theorist, because I see too many numbers and I get pretty confused pretty quickly, and then I text Dimitri and have him explain them to me. But here's one of the things that strikes me about the exit polling, and just looking at it, just take one example of this that sort of got me thinking about this epistemological crisis that seems to be at least a possible explanation for what's happening right now. That one of the questions, I'll just say two questions that have to do with the pandemic. One of the questions that was asked was, do you think US efforts to contain the coronavirus pandemic are going well? And the responses to that question, maybe somewhat surprisingly, 51% of the voters asked said yes. They think that the response to contain the virus is going well. And they're very committed to that view, or somewhat committed to that view. But in that group, right, of 51%, it was 4 to 5 times more likely for Republicans to answer in an affirmative way than Democrats, right? So that's just one sort of question to ponder. And then the other is kind of a little bit more of a values question, perhaps. Do you consider wearing a face mask in public more of and the choices were personal choice or public health responsibility? 30% of respondents said personal choice, 67% said public health responsibility. But again, Republicans were 3 times more likely to say personal choice. Now, what I wonder about those things, right, is are we simply dealing with a difference in values? That we have people who disagree about what it means to handle the pandemic well, and or what it means to behave responsibly vis-a-vis their fellow citizens as individuals confronted with the pandemic? Or is there something else going on there, something that sort of gets even deeper than interests and values to these fundamental questions of ways of knowing? So that's one kind of big question I want us to think about. And so one of the things to think about is, are we dealing with large segments of the electorate who are in a fundamental way inhabiting different realities? And one of the things that I sent to the department a few weeks ago was this kind of software that somebody created where it has a sort of, you could shift at the bottom, you go on Twitter and you could shift your ideology from far right to far left and sort of give you a vision of what the Twitter world looks like using different algorithms based on ideological preferences. And it was really it's sort of shocking in many ways to use this software because you really get a picture of what these extraordinarily different realities look like. And I think that there's something there that I think is really important. I just want to say, in terms of the kind of big why question, why do we have this crisis of epistemology? I think that one of the things that's clearly happening in our political culture, and Pat gave the example of, this sort of confidence question that has been asked for generations, right? What is our confidence in various institutions in our society? Clearly, we have a crisis of legitimacy on some level in people's trust in government, but also in all sorts of other institutions like higher education, scientific institutions, religious institutions. And a lot of what's happening there, if you try to have a conversation with somebody about these things, and let's just using the pandemic example, if somebody is having a political argument about the pandemic and somebody tries to make a scientific argument in that context, the immediate sort of go-to, if the person says something they don't like, is, well, that science has been politicized, right? That science is no longer legitimate because it's been politicized. Or if we talk about somebody having a particular religious perspective that leads them to vote a particular way, of course, there's there's a turn in that conversation to say, well, that's not really your faith. That's just your faith has been politicized. It's not really about religion anymore. It's about imposing your will and using this as a justification. So there's a kind of crisis of legitimacy on several fronts. And I think that to me is kind of a central part of what's happening right now. And I think I'll stop there, and maybe sort of the next bit of what I wanted to say, I'll save for the next round of kind of what the future might look like or could look like or maybe should look like. But with that, I'll just sort of put those big questions out there and hand it back over to Pat. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, fantastic, Nick. Thank you. We're going to have kind of a more of a lightning round, I think, here on the what next question. I'm paying attention to time, and I want to leave ample time to get to some of these great questions that are coming in. So why don't we each take maybe 2 minutes or so to raise a point or two about the what next question, 3 minutes max, Dimitri, and then we'll get to some of these questions. Thanks.
All right, you have my word. I'm going fast. So for me, in terms of looking forward about what's next as a result of sort of the 2020 election, I think that I really briefly, I need to highlight what the 2020 election did, and also importantly, what it did not do. And just as a side, I just want to say that it is a very tall task to go after my brilliant colleague, Nick, who raises these huge and important questions. And so I'll do my best. To me, the arc, looking forward from the 2020 election, there are two narratives. And the first of which revolves around the public's rejection of President Trump's quest for a second term. And the second story features the more complicated public judgment of the Republican Party as a whole, particularly looking towards the future. So first, it's notable that President Trump lost the election by a decent amount, by a margin of 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. It is the same margin that he beat Hillary Clinton by in 2016. And this time he lost by more than 6 million votes in the popular vote, recalling that he lost the popular vote to Clinton by over 3 million votes. Now, those numbers, I know you all know these numbers, but they're actually really rather remarkable, I think, because if you put it another way,
Joe Biden in 2020 and Donald Trump in 2016 each won 306 electoral votes. But Biden had to win the popular vote by almost 4.5 points to do what Trump did in losing the popular vote by 2 points. And the Electoral College is a peculiar institution, and one that I'm going to touch on just a little bit. But the reason why I say that it's notable that Trump lost, even though it's obvious, is because most incumbent presidents who run for re-election win. In losing, Trump became only the 10th incumbent president in history to fail in their re-election campaign, and the first to do so since George Herbert Walker Bush lost to Bill Clinton. Now, it's worth pointing out that even in defeat, Trump received more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016 in terms of raw numbers and in terms of vote share. Obviously, what changed is that turnout was much higher. Turnout was actually the highest it's been in more than a century. And Joe Biden did much better than did Hillary Clinton. And he received almost 80 million votes. She received 66 million. But so while Biden won convincingly, he didn't sort of sweep the Democratic Party into power, right? In fact, the Republican Party gained 12 seats in the House and have so far maintained control of the Senate. And most significantly, and this is where I've been leading, most significantly is that Republicans defended and actually even expanded their control of state legislatures. And one of the reasons this is so significant is because control of state legislatures was extremely contentious this year because of the upcoming mandated redistricting that follows the completion of the 2020 census. A quick refresher, even though I know you all know this, the census every 10 years, right? The census happens every 10 years, count every person in the United States. And district boundaries have to be redrawn to reflect shifts in the population. And since redistricting in most states is done by the legislature, the party that is controlling the legislature, the state legislature, during census years has the ability to draw maps that are favorable to their party with the knowledge that those maps will be the ones used until the next census. So basically it's the power to bend the electoral map to your benefit for 5 electoral cycles, for a decade. In the last census was in 2010, and it also featured a Republican wave election with the Republican Party picking up more than 660 seats across the country that put them in the position to draw the kinds of maps that in the 2020 election allowed them to narrowly lose the Wisconsin state vote for presidential election while winning 5 of 8 House elections in Wisconsin and maintaining a 61-38 advantage majority in the state assembly. So after the 2020 elections, as I'm looking forward, one of the things that is important is to note that Republicans are set to have control over crafting of twice as many congressional districts as Democrats are. And that puts them in a very favorable position moving forward. And it's extra significant because it highlights, I think, one of the most significant problems in US politics. And it's simple and straightforward. It's simply a lack of democracy. And this is something that a journalist, Ezra Klein, had noted before I was reading a little while ago, and something I've been thinking about a lot. And so the mythology of democratic governance, of self-governance, features a feedback, right? A feedback between political parties and political candidates competing to win elections. They either win or lose. And then if in office, they either succeed or fail. And then the public either punishes or rewards them for their time in office. And then based on that, they either stay the course or they change their approach as a response. And right now, that feedback loop is broken, but it's mostly broken for the Republican Party. And before you dismiss me as just a liberal arts professor hating on the Republican Party, let me explain what I mean by this, because what I mean is there are several structural reasons that the Republican Party has become less tethered to the middle of public opinion. And what it means is that they have been able to win and maintain political power without needing to appeal to the majority of the voting public. And the reasons for this are twofold. The first is that our political system weighs the votes of small states and rural areas more heavily. And the second is related to what I just discussed about partisan politicians controlling the way districts are drawn. So one of the most significant political developments of the last few decades has been the increasing political salience of the urban-rural divide. This is something I've been thinking about a lot. And Democrats, we all know the story, right? Democrats, they dominate in the cities, and Republicans, they dominate in rural areas. And this, the sort of development has given Republicans a structural advantage in elections, and which they have been able to reinforce then through sort of sophisticated mapping following, for example, the 2010 elections. Now, political scientists who study these things estimate that Democrats would need to win the popular vote, the national popular vote, by between 3 and 4 points to have a realistic shot at winning the Electoral College. Note that Joe Biden won by 4.5%. And they would need to win by 6 to 7 points to take the Senate and 3 to 4 points to win the House. I mean, the takeaway from this is that Democrats and Republicans face very different electoral incentives. Democrats need, in order to gain power, electoral power, Democrats need to appeal to a broader swathe of voters, including those that might not sort of line up just in the extreme base. I mean, this explains how Joe Biden becomes the nominee, right? Biden's appeal is driven by his potential to win back some of the sort of white working class voters who voted for Trump in 2016. And he did that, right? If you look at the polls, Trump's advantage among white men shrunk considerably from 14 percentage points to 3 percentage points. So the takeaway is that because Democrats face this structural disadvantage, they have to seek not just a majority, but an overwhelming majority in order to translate into power. And this is the last thing I'm going to say because I can see Pat getting that look. The contrast is Republicans have the opposite incentives. Their advantages in small and rural states mean that they can win the presidency, they can win the Senate, they can win the House, they can win state legislatures, and they can do it all with fewer votes. And they do. Both the partisans in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the base, they would love to have ideologically rigid and fighting candidates. But the Republican Party is freer now to nominate them without risking electoral success. And the only motivation for political parties to change is losing elections because it sucks. And if you lose an election and you see that if you maintain the course, you're going to lose more elections in the future, then that is a motivation to a shift of strategy. But the dynamics of our current political system mean that the Republican Party is insulated from much of that pain because they can lose votes and still win power. I mean, this is why, so I'm glad I'm not going to be the very last person to go because whereas other people are ending on an optimistic note, unfortunately, I don't actually view the future very, very optimistically. As I look forward, the Georgia runoff election becomes huge because if the Republican Party maintains control of the Senate, then I see no reason not to expect a redux of the final years of the Obama administration, which was highlighted by, congressional inaction and gridlock. And that's the sad, not optimistic note that I'll end it on. Maybe it will become more optimistic in the questions. And so I'll throw it back. Sorry, that was a little more than 3 minutes.
It's quite you're you, and we love you. Nick.
That was Dimitri style 3 minutes. No, that was great, Dimitri. So it was worth it. And thank you for the kind words about me. And I send them right back your way and to Pat. I'm glad Pat's closing it out because Pat's always optimistic. And that's good. So I guess where I would like to just, in some brief comments here is to say something about that maybe will be a little bit provocative, and I'll try to do it in a non-partisan way, or sort of say something about both sides if I can, and that is that all the stuff I was talking about before, this sort of crisis of epistemology and so on. One of the things that I see happening already, and it's been happening, and there's been an argument about it over the last several years, is a kind of focus on politicians that are very either really loved or really loathed, right? So if we just take the last two presidents as examples, President Obama and President Trump, there's been a lot of focus, both energy, positive energy of people who really love them, and negative energy of people who really don't. that have kind of defined a lot of our political discourse. And I think one of the things that that does is it draws our attention away from things that matter even more. And Dimitri just gave us a really good example of a kind of lower level, sort of micro level political action that matters so much. And we don't, in most people, right, a vast majority of people have no clue that any of that's happening, right? So, and again, that's not a partisan statement. That just has to do with the functioning of our political system, the things that Dimitri was just describing. You could, sort of, the partisan advantages he was explaining, descriptively, right, which are there. But whatever you think of whatever your partisan position, if you have a concern about democracy, the functioning democracy, then I think some of what Dimitri just said, should concern you. So I guess what I want to say about what happens next is I think this really was, as I think both Pat and Dimitri have mentioned, an election that on some level, right, the presidential election, right, was largely read as a kind of referendum on a particular individual. And you had this sort of incredible mobilization both in support of that individual and an even larger mobilization against him. But I think one of the things that's very concerning to me is to sort of focus on that particular individual as a cause rather than as a symptom, right? I think that there's a strong case to be made, again, love or loathe, that Mr. Trump is a manifestation of something deeper happening in the American body politic. That, I think, is the most important takeaway for me, is that there might be a sense on the left of a kind of a victory and maybe that sense of victory might lead to a slide into a sort of complacency as a result of defeating this person. But I think that's a real danger in terms of these more fundamental questions confronting us on the level of epistemology, values, interests, all the things that really matter in politics. And I think on the right, I think there's also some big questions, right? And who knows what will happen next, in the next few minutes, little in the next few days or next few months, in terms of what Mr. Trump decides to do with his future and that decision, right? And the impact that will have on the internal conversations on the right, sort of generally, and in the Republican Party in particular. And I'm very interested to hear. I mean, I have many Republicans in my family, and there's kind of this very interesting polarization within the Republican Party, right? Of people who say Trump is not reflective of what the Republican Party really is. This is an aberration. He will go away, and we will restore, a party that I can defend. I'm thinking of one particular family member who'd say that. And then I have other family members who are absolutely diehard. He is the savior of not only the Republican Party, but the Republic. And so what happens on the American right now in these next few months, I think will be really important and fascinating to watch. And again, I think one of the things that I'm going to keep my eye on is not the personalities that are getting the headlines, but what's happening underneath and what does it reveal about our political culture. All right, I'll shut up now and hand it over to Pat. Thanks.
Wow, guys, that was fantastic stuff. I'm getting some really nice compliments, by the way, that aren't even questions. They're compliments on you guys. And so thank you. I'm going to be super brief. There's something that no one has asked a question about yet. I have, 10 or 15 great questions, and nobody has asked a question yet about the implications of the election for U.S. foreign policy and role in the world. And so this is an area that is near and dear to my heart, and I'd like to share just a couple of thoughts. First, U.S. foreign policy is largely overlooked in election cycles because, barring wartime or, other, crises that have a clear foreign policy bent to them. Why? Because voters don't vote on foreign policy very much, right? So it doesn't show up in the debates a lot. And yet, if you think about the tremendous amount of power that presidents wield in the realm of foreign policy, and yet, if you think about some of the biggest issues facing our society, not just nationally and locally, but globally, climate change, global pandemic, peaceful rise of China, revisionist Russia power, Iran, North Korea, trade, and what is a fair global economic system look like? These are all foreign policy issues, and they're all matter to each and every one of you listening and around the world. So what does this move to a Biden administration look like? And I should say, with truth in advertising here, that I had a short experience working for Biden a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away at the turn of the century. And so I do have a sense of what the Biden administration will do. The first thing I think that you can look for is a move from this kind of America First orientation that the current administration has adopted to more of an American-led emphasis, which really means a return to multilateralism. So the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accords, from day one, President-elect Biden has said that the United States will rejoin them. I think you can expect some benefits from that. If nothing else, the United States will have a seat at the table. They will have agenda setting power. The US economy is still the world's biggest economy. It carries a lot of weight. It's the elephant in the room. But when the elephant doesn't show up or goes golfing, as what happened at the most recent G8, it sends a signal to the rest of the world that they don't really matter and they're not valued. And so one of the concerns I have is, even if the Biden administration makes this pivot, it's not like people are going to instantly forget, because one of the things that the Trump administration foreign policy is I think deserves a bit more scrutiny, and I think there are actually some positive elements of it that I can talk about later. But it is a bit like, you've been cheated on if you're an ally of the United States, right? And you don't really forgive, you don't welcome them back that quickly. And so I'm really interested to see if the US credibility is going to be restored. I mean, Obama, if you recall, got a Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 just for not being George W. Bush. Totally not deserved, by the way, in my opinion. But is the world going to receive Biden the same way, or is it going to be a bit different? And how much should we care? I think we should care a lot, and I can talk about more why later. The second thing is, I think that the Biden administration is going to double down on alliances, and especially those with democracies. This is something actually that both administrations at least pay lip service to. This is something Pompeo has talked about. There's an idea of a league of democracies that's been floating out there from administration to administration. I do think that Biden is going to start there, square one, with NATO, with Korea, with Japan, with Australia, and others, as a means to balance China and Russia and increase US leverage, which many perceive to have been diminished over the course of time. If if the US is about 25% of the world's economy, and you're able to have an alliance that has about 50%, that's pretty big, right? Pretty big. And I want to conclude with this point about democracy and coming back to legitimacy where I started, which is, if the United States can't get its own house in order democratically, it's not going to be viewed as a leader or a credible arbiter of or a partner. And this is where efforts, I think, to protect democracy at home are going to be huge. And no matter where you are on the political spectrum, I really would love to see if we have a two-party system, which someone asked about a third party, which we can talk about that. I'd really like to see the parties having the dialogue about real substantive ideas that affect all Americans in the world, instead of what we're seeing with the alternative. And the biggest indicator of legitimacy, one of the biggest ones, is the will of the people to defend it when it's perceived to be under threat. And one of the heartening things, I will be optimistic, Dimitri and Nick here, is that I do think, and not just at a national level, which is where we all tend to think, there's research that shows that most people pick their teams, their tribes on a national level, but at a local level, politics are a lot different. And there's a lot more space for change at a local level. And so with that, and that's a shout out to my mom who emailed me to make sure to raise that point. So there you go, Mom, I love you. And with that, let's turn to some of these questions, and thank you all for your attention. We're about an hour in. I know we'll stay until 8 o'clock to answer questions, but we won't be offended if you leave either. There are some Sinoleni questions here, so let's get to them. I will ask let's just start with a couple with a basic set of questions that I received 3 of. And so I said 3 questions for the panel. What counts as reliable television news channel for news? Where do you get your news? On TV in particular, but if you have thoughts on that elsewhere, I mean, we do live in an environment where there's so many media sources and information. People are getting their news from a lot of different places. Help us out with this. Professor Kelly, would you like to lead off?
Sure. That's a great question. And it's one that I am embarrassed to say that I think about a tremendous amount. Embarrassed because I still don't have a conclusive, pithy answer. So the best way for me to think about this question is in terms of where I get my news. So I do not watch TV news. That's my answer to where to get reliable television news. I'm sure it exists, but I don't watch it. And I think that finding a credible news source is a difficult task if you make it one. And that's because of so people, human beings, are very bad at perceiving objectivity and bias in the news. So there's something called the hostile media effect. And the hostile media effect describes an effect where you can take 2 people on either sides of an issue and you can show them news coverage of that issue, the same news coverage. And both of them will view that news coverage as biased against their preferred position. So this applies to partisanship, right? If you are a Democrat or Republican and you might view the same news source and you are going to see it as biased against either the Democratic or the Republican Party. And this is sort of a psychological tendency, and it's one that increases as people get more politically knowledgeable and have stronger opinions. And it really is an impediment to finding good, unbiased news source. So my advice is this. Because our perceptions of objectivity are unreliable, I place my stock in professional journalists. So they're, the sort of time-tested, traditional professional journalists, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNN. I know Trump really hates CNN, but I view CNN as not very good rather than very liberal. I just don't think it's very good. So I prefer newsprint, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. Those are my 3 go-to.
I really have thank you, Dimitri. I have no special expertise in this. I will say this, though. I think that, one of the greatest, biases in the news and the television news in particular, but I think this is true in other sort of venues for news is sensationalism, right? I mean, so I think there's so much of what is passing for news now that the primary objective of it is to get clicks, is to get people to tune in and stay in and have lots of breaking news alerts and so on and so forth. So I think if there's a lot of that happening on whatever you're looking at in a news source, I think there's probably better places to look. Not to say that doesn't have any utility for your, just kind of whatever it is, whether it's entertainment or getting your blood pressure up or whatever you're looking for. But I think that there's better ways to do it. And Dimitri just gave a really helpful way of thinking about it. And also, I think that, one institution I think we should still all trust is the library. And I love librarians so much. And librarians, have done really, great work in information literacy. And you can go online right now and find these really helpful information literacy, kind of guides that are just useful. We give them to students as they're kind of trying to figure out sources and that sort of thing for research. But I would love for every single citizen, voter, to just spend like a few minutes with that. And if they're having doubts about something they're reading or watching, to refer back to it, maybe put it on the refrigerator or something like that. Because I think there's something about that just sort of asking yourself some basic questions as you're interacting with a news source. I think that could be really good if people were willing to do it. For reasons Dimitri described, I think a lot of us aren't willing to do that sort of work intellectually, but I think it would be great for the Republic if we did.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that on TV, just to go to the direct TV question, I would say you want high journalistic standards. You want people who are going to fact check. You want people who are going to be two-sided instead of one-sided news, right? These are basic things. And to seek quotes from different perspectives instead of one perspective, and do so in a systematic way. I'm not sure that there is a singular television news that does this. Maybe the PBS NewsHour would be the closest that I would off the top of my head. But if in the absence of that, you want to seek news from different sources. So we actually have, especially in election season, I flip between different channels to see how they're covering stories and differently, and look at the sources they're using. And that's it's an educational experience. So on TV, that's what I'd add. Okay, we have some. Let me ask a question about the urban-rural divide here. Let's see, this is from Gary. Why do rural states or Midwest states vote for Trump? What was important to this group in terms of issues that led them to vote for Trump? Either of you guys want to take a stab at this? I can say something as well, but. Dimitri says no.
No, I can say something about this. So one of the most important, I'm looking at this book right here. I'll even show it to you. One of the most important books, go buy this book. It's called The Politics of Resentment. And it's about it's about rural attitudes towards urban areas in Wisconsin. And it's by one of my inspirational teachers in graduate school. I think that there are a lot of different answers that could be given to this question, but to me, the biggest one boils down to the belief, two things. One, the unequal economic growth. That is, you have sort of economic growth in this country being concentrated in cities, and a lot of rural areas suffering economically, and in particular with young people leaving and going to the cities and moving to the cities, sort of a hollowing out. And this is a familiar story, but to me the bigger thing is it kind of this is it's a hard question to just answer off the top and in a public forum, because to me the real answer is that what Trump did was he voiced the resentment and anger that many people were feeling about the sort of elites, sort of cosmopolitans, and did it unapologetically, and in a way that they could rally behind. I think one of the most interesting things to me about the sort of Trump phenomenon is the use of flags, right? Like the flying of flags, which is a very is something that you do. You fly the flag of the country, you fight under the flag, and so there's this. To me, it indicates this very fierce allegiance, this fierce support. Like Trump said that he could go out and shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue, and his supporters wouldn't change their minds. And I think that he inspires a level of devotion in part because he is willing to fight with the people that his supporters want him to fight with. That's my ultimate answer, is that he's fighting with the people that they want him to fight with.
Yeah, that's great, Dimitri. And the only thing I'd add to that is that I think that one of the things that happens a lot in politics, especially, is is the kind of prevalence of either or thinking when what we really need is both and thinking. And so I think that in a lot of the analyses of, the kind of rural, the average rural voter, the rural Trump supporter, so on, you'll get a sort of really hard argument that says this is about, economic displacement, et cetera, and some of the issues that Dimitri talked about. Or you'll get this sort of other perspective, which is this is about racial resentment, and this is, really this sort of deplorable sort of argument. And I think that, to me, of course, both of those things contain truths and falsehoods, right? And then obviously, as a general proposition, I think that you have to think about these things in terms of multiple factors, right, and manifesting themselves in how people are behaving politically and their attitudes. And I absolutely agree with Dimitri. I think what Trump did very, very effectively, right? And it's one of these great ironies, right? And this has happened before in American politics, when somebody who has no business in terms of their identity being a populist, right, becomes a populist champion. And it's precisely, I think Dimitri nailed it on the head. And the same thing happened with the kind of evangelical identity, I think, in terms of the high level support for Trump. It was not really about Trump in terms of who he was or what he believed in. It was about who Trump was willing to stand up to, right? These are people who have felt marginalized and bullied in one way or another, and then they had a bully on their side, right? It's that story, right? And so that, to me, at least, like, that's a central part of it. Now, there again, I don't want to say that's the whole story, because I think it's a both and thing. There's a lot of other things going on, but that, to me, was really in interacting with people that I know who are conservative, and who, for whether it's religious conservatives or other kinds of conservative, they really found that was what they loved about him. That's why they were flying the flag, was he's standing up for me and I feel marginalized. Now, whether or not they should feel marginalized, that's a whole nother conversation to have, but I think that's part of what's going on.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's get to a couple questions. We have Annika and Catherine asking about polling. So what happened with polling? Why did the pollsters get so wrong, especially at the congressional level? It seems like the last two presidential elections polling has been way off in swing states, which means campaigns may be prioritizing resources based on inaccurate information. Heard that the reason for inaccurate polling is that people don't trust institutions and are less likely to answer polls at all. Do you think this is correct, and how do we reverse the trend? Polling.
I guess that's directed at me. To address the second part first, the how do we reverse the trend? I don't know if the trend will be reversed anytime soon. So I think actually the polls were off, right? The polls are off, and they were off in 2016. But I actually think they were off in 2016 and they were off in 2020 for different reasons. And that's because I think that so the big problem in 2016 was that it had to do with how pollsters were weighting likely voters. And they simply underestimated turnout among people without a college degree, who typically have been less educated people, are typically less likely to turn out to vote. But they turned out a lot for candidate Trump in 2016. And the thing is that in 2020, so the thing about these polling organizations, right, is that they are not partisan. Right, their credibility depends on their accuracy, and so they're not motivated to try to sell a story. They're motivated to adopt the best practices and change where necessary in order to be more accurate in their polling. And so I think that by and large, most of the things that I've seen polling, they have sort of certainly corrected for the misweighting of education and began weighting by education. But I actually think that in 2020, and okay, this is all speculation, because we can't know unless a very, very specific and special kind of data set comes out that I don't know that exists. But I do think that that thing that the questioner Annika noted about the trust in institutions, and in particularly trust in polls, I do think that as we're thinking about the central place that President Trump has in the Republican Party right now, is that, one of the big things the president has is a big microphone. And one of the things that President Trump has consistently used his microphone for is to berate the polls, fake polls, fake news, fake polls, fake news. Any poll that says that he's not winning is a fake poll. And I do think, given what we know about the effects of elite rhetoric in terms of shaping partisans' attitudes, I do think that it's possible that the consistent rhetoric against polling as being fake could have contributed to sort of discrepancies in terms of who is more or less likely to answer polls. And so if this time around, people who are Trump supporters were systematically less likely to answer the polls, then that could be part of the problem. The other thing, actually, I saw a really interesting analysis of this very question, and it showed the consequences of the lockdown surrounding the coronavirus. And what happened was, because there was a partisan discrepancy in terms of who was adhering to those kinds of lockdowns and staying in their house, because Democrats were systematically more likely to stay at home, they also began answering and doing more surveys. They became more likely to answer surveys. So I think that probably played a part. And so ultimately, I think that there was that they were sampling more Democrats, and that Trump supporters were possibly less likely to choose to respond to polls because of the sort of rhetoric aimed at them.
Pat, I have nothing to say about polls, but I want to take this opportunity to ask you a question, which may be in there, but I wanted to hear, there are some people who are saying that they have been surprised at the fact that, the Trump administration did not, commit troops during his term. It appears that he'll leave office, I think, the first president since Carter, right? To not have, did not sort of have a significant international conflict on his watch. So I'm wondering what you think, what you're kind of, and you mentioned there have been some positive takeaways from the Trump foreign policy. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that. I just want to throw that out there as a question.
Oh, Nick, you're swell to ask the question. The short answer is, the one area of consistency between, the Obama administration, if you read this article called The Obama Doctrine by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, which is a really interesting piece, the Obama Doctrine is don't do stupid shit, was the, and, Trump has been consistent in not being willing to commit US troops to military adventurism, interventionism, whatever you want to call it. And I think recent US history suggests that is a good thing. I also think in terms of opening diplomatic channels with North Korea could end up paying dividends down the line, although there has been some valid critiques of the process and how it was prepared. I mean, typically summits are months and months and months in preparation, and there's a phone call and it happens. It's a very different way of running foreign policy. And and there has been some streamlining. And as somebody, again, truth in advertising, who is a huge fan of diplomacy and the State Department has been gutted during the Trump administration. I think that that gutting is bad for America and bad for the world. But I think that, as the state, one of the things that Biden will do is reconstruct and reinvigorate the State Department. It will be a very good time for people interested in being diplomats to start taking the Foreign Service exam. But I think the critique of too much red tape in government and inefficiencies is very valid. And it was very valid at the State Department. Can I tell you how frustrating it is to try to get a memo through to navigate the bureaucracy? It's horrible. So I do think that there will be some, legacies of the Trump administration that even that could end up bearing some fruit in the long term. The last one I think that we will look for historically, though, is going to be the Abraham Accords and the deal in the Middle East. And we can, that's a huge can of worms. But the big takeaway is that getting other states in the region to recognize Israel and to balance against Iran, and Israel and Saudi Arabia are cooperating on a much deeper level than they have in forever. That could be good for Middle Eastern stability, but remains to be seen, because it is the Middle East after all. Okay, let me read another great question here from Dulcie. So when I think about the entrenchment of American voters into two opposing camps, the breakdown for me is along the lines of individualism versus collectivization. Individualism has always been fundamental to the American identity, more myth than reality, of course, but foundational nonetheless. But we've gone through periods when collectivization was not so distasteful to so many. What are the markers of those periods in American history when the public was more open to communal good over individual benefit? Does it always take a war? Will it ever be possible again as our country diversifies? Or are we only willing to share with folks who look like us? Looking at you, Nick, you're on my screen.
That's a really great question, Dulcie. And hi, Dulcie, I miss you. Dulcie was one of our great student back in the day, and actually recently ran for office herself. And I know she was focused on these questions of the common good in her campaign. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't have a great answer, except to say that it is, I think, one of the kind of central paradoxes or challenges in politics generally, and I think is especially challenging for liberal democracies. And that is this question of how, in a society that is primarily focused on, or at least has a foundational commitment to individual rights and personal liberty, how in such a context do you get people to care about others? How in such a context do you get people to subordinate their private interests and so on to the common good? That's kind of the big question, and that's been a big question for people ever since there's been politics, right? And so I think that one of the things that I will say that is not a really great answer, but maybe sort of starting on a road toward answers, would be that I think one thing that I'm somebody who studies political theory, and obviously I care a lot about ideas and sort of persuasion and that sort of thing. But the longer I live, the more I'm convinced that kind of rationality and rational arguments aren't quite what they're cracked up to be philosophically in real politics. And I know Dimitri can bear that out in real political psychology information in terms of what motivates people. And so one of the things that has really been interesting an interest for me is to think about, and I've done this kind of historically with the abolitionist movement and with the civil rights movement, is to try to understand in those contexts where you have movements for an expansion of liberty, movements for the common good, the sort of thing that Dulcie is asking about. And one of the things that I sort of, one of the puzzles that I'm interested in looking at as I look at those movements is how philosophically and practically do those movements gain traction, right? And recognizing that it often is not the case, in politics, that it's the compelling argument that wins the day, right? You could have the most compelling argument in the world. I remember, one of my favorite Frederick Douglass pieces is after he spent 20 years as an abolitionist saying, I spent 20 years, and people have been at it longer than that, with the most, compelling rational arguments, religious arguments, moral arguments, even drawing on our artistic, things to move people. And I feel like in my 20 years as an abolitionist, we're worse off than when I started, right? So one of the things that leads us to, to wonder about is politics really about reason, about morality, about our religious convictions, Or is it, at the end of the day, just about power? And what is that? What are the consequences of that, right? And so I think I'll stop. But I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing right now, and then I'll just sort of thinking about what's going on the left in this country, and sort of these sort of a very heightened moment of social consciousness, a heightened moment of social protest, and so on, is you have very strong, very clear, moral arguments that X is unjust or Y is unjust, and we really need to do something about it. And those are extraordinarily compelling. And then you have the question of bringing that down to the ground of practical politics, and what does it look like to actually move the country from, sort of an unjust state of affairs to a more just one. And that's where I think, there's sort of certain political, models, I think that one could look to that are much more in that kind of realist power politics mode that might be, sort of important to keep in mind, even in pursuits of the common good.
Okay, we're about 3 minutes away, but there's so many good questions. I'm just going to do a quick greatest hits read, and then we can have some rapid fire response, and we'll call it. I've tried to group a couple people have asked, Ava and Tony have asked about what kind of hope do we have? Are we stuck in a hyperpolarized era, or is there any hope? And what type of prescriptions might we have for healing the divide? Question from Stella: How will the results of the election impact the trajectory of social movements they've been organizing? Specifically thinking of Black Lives Matter, prison reform, and immigrants' rights campaigns. How will the Biden administration handle social unrest? And gosh, there's just so many great questions. I really appreciate the questions everybody's sending in. Last one I will raise. It's a short one. A cable news network from Europe states the United States no longer follows any particular religion, but treats political party affiliation as its replacement. Do the speakers disagree? So with that, if you guys would like to respond to any of those as a kind of final, or anything else you'd like to say in closing, that would be great. And I will let you all lead off. Dimitri, you have anything to say to this?
To the last one, I disagree. I don't think political partisanship has replaced religion. To the question of what will the Biden administration do with respect to Black Lives Matters and those sorts of movements, mostly I suspect a rhetorical change, since policing matters are issues that are mostly made up to the states and local governments. I suspect there'll be a decrease in militarization of the police provided by the federal government. And I forgot what was the first question again, but I liked it.
Any hope for healing polarization? I mean, are we stuck in this kind of hyper-polarized environment forever? And if so, if not, what's the antidote?
That's $1 million question right there. I'll be honest with you. That's $1 million question. The United States is a grand experiment, a large multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious democracy in an era of sort of unlimited media choice. And yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. Sorry, that's not a very conclusive answer, but it's true.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't have any profound insights here, but I think that just to combine the kind of Stella's question about social movements and the question of hope, I do think that the social movement mobilization over the last several months, has had a big impact on our political culture and brought about a kind of shift in consciousness that is, I think, will prove to be historically significant on a number of fronts. What will be really fascinating to see is that this is where it was having Biden as the standard bearer of the Democratic Party was in some ways out of sync with the moment, in a lot of ways out of sync with the moment, in my opinion. I've argued with the department about this. Because Biden has a 50-year record of being Joe Biden, which is a super nice guy, a kind of moderate kind of Democrat. And so, and I think that's, so the kind of attempt to paint him as the, the leader of a radical left was in many ways, at least from my perspective, kind of silly. So now the question though, is Biden clearly benefited from this mobilization and now has to govern, and he has to govern possibly looking across the table, from Mitch McConnell, and so whatever one loves or loathes Mitch McConnell, we know what Mitch McConnell is all about in terms of governing opposite a Democrat, and then so he'll have McConnell there, and then he'll have this mobilization over here, and so I think and I don't know, there's a lot, we could have another 2-hour conversation about Biden's appointments so far. I think the appointments matter, but ultimately the kind of direction and priorities matter probably more. And so trying to figure out what happens to that energy of the mobilization that we've seen on the left in the wake of a Biden administration, I think will be really one of the big stories of what happens next. I think one thing that's clear is that, look, Kamala Harris is a progressive. She has a progressive voting record. They tried to kind of refashion her political identity a little bit for the general election for electoral reasons, but she's a progressive. So I think her impact on Biden will be really important. And then I think also on those issues that were mentioned in the question, criminal justice issues, policing issues, immigration issues, I think there's a kind of sort of mainstream Democratic position that's no longer really tenable, especially if you want to have a mobilized electorate for the Democrats in the midterms and in 2024. So I'm fascinated to see how it plays out. I have hopes about how I want it to play out, but yeah, it'll be really fascinating to watch, and also just really important for the country how it works out. Thank
you. I'll wrap up with responding to the question about polarization. I mean, one thing is, I'd like to see the role of the parties, the political parties, change. And I'd also like to see, I mean, there's lots of different reforms to the electoral system. I think that could help in ways that would be in the interests of both parties and not just viewed as this kind of kumite power politics. One of the great pieces from political science is in the 1950s, there's this report toward a responsible party model. I don't know, Dimitri, you might have read that at some point. Which parties have changed. They used to be aggregators of a platform and preferences and representative and much more involved in policy, whereas now they've become electioneering and agents of campaigns instead of anything involved in real policy that's going to help Americans. So I think that might be something worth considering. But at the end of the day, it's the stuff on the local levels and things that we're doing at Linfield that give me a lot of hope. Dimitri and Nick are involved in something called CURE, which is the Collaborative for Urban-Rural Engagement, where people, can promote conversations from people with different background and different lived experiences. And if we have a willingness to listen and to learn from one another, and that commitment to civility, I think will help a great deal. And even if at least how the media portrays people in Washington don't do the same. I promised the students one more plug for the department. If you want to ever attend a Pizza and Politics, either Zoom wise or in person, if you will follow us on social media at Linfield POLS_IR. Ooh, hi Luna. Or Polytalks, which is available. It's a podcast available on Spotify and other normal things. I hope you will. Thanks again to Kaylee and Joni and everybody. And thanks most of all to you, our audience, for being patient with us as we went 4 minutes over time. So have a great holiday season and thanks again.